And my next guest has written a couple of pieces I think were particularly significant recently. Not that all his pieces aren't significant, but these two are the ones I particularly wanted to talk about. Dayen has been on the program before. You probably know his writing. He's the author of the book Chain of Title and co-author of the book Fat Cat, the Steve Mnuchin story. He is also a regular contributor at The Intercept, as well as being published in other publications. He will also be, as of June 1st, if my sources are correct, the executive editor of The American Prospect. But he joins us now. So first of all, Dave, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thanks, RJ.
And did I get all of that right about?
My resume takes up most of the time of a discussion, but yeah, I'll be starting the Prospect June 1st.
And we'll be right back after this. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Yes, well, congratulations, first of all, on that. Well deserved. And secondly, okay, the two pieces I wanted to talk to you about, the first one that I thought was really important was one in The Intercept called How to Think About Breaking Up Big Tech. Now, this is an idea that's gone in 5 years, I would say, from being so fringe that people like us were just laughed at, or at least I was, for even mentioning it, to, that may just be me, but to one that people are seriously talking about. And Elizabeth Warren, for example, presidential candidate, Senator Warren is seriously looking at how to do it. And this was an excellent piece for a variety of reasons, including the fact that, as you point out, really, if you strip away the seemingly exotic or novel structure of the technology, breaking up big tech is really based on principles that have been around for a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, and the way I sort of structured this piece was, recognizing that we're now at a then they fight you point in this debate. We were ignored and laughed at, and now it's being fought. And the fight is coming from very familiar sources, people in many cases funded by big tech or supported by them in some way or another. And the arguments are very much the same. And one of those arguments is that this is novel. This is somehow a radical reinterpretation of American law that will upend the tech industry in ways that no one's ever seen before. And that's really just not true. There are many times in our history when we have seen these concentrated, very powerful entities that control various parts along a chain of an economic market. And the U.S. government decides, okay, we're going to break that structure so other people have a chance to compete. And the number one area that I brought up was the railroads in 1906. So railroads had traditionally been not only able, by virtue of being the only structure available at the time of the Gilded Age, to transport goods or people or communications, that they charged exorbitant rates, but also they started combining with entities that had goods to move. So in anthracite coal country, the railroads were in other subsidiaries also owning the coal companies whose goods they would ship at the exclusion of competitors. And what we did in 1906 with the Hepburn Act is say that if you are a railroad, you can't also own a coal company whose goods you ship in a discriminatory way so that other coal companies could not subsequently get their goods to market or to different sources. So that was done 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. And it's really the same principle that Warren is using in this policy idea, which is to say that Amazon cannot be the host of a marketplace and also be selling goods on that marketplace, competing with the marketplace participants and favoring its own goods at the expense of those rivals. And so it's called structural separation. We've seen it in telecom, we've seen it in railroads, we've seen it in banking. That's essentially what Glass-Steagall was all about. And this is not novel. This is done often throughout American history to promote diversity, to promote inclusion, to promote competition, to fulfill all sorts of different goals.
Well, first of all, I got to tell you, David, I've always found it a little comical that one of the objections the tech industry and its allies raises to this kind of breakup or restructuring is that it's novel. I mean, you're the guys who disrupt stuff, right? You should like novel. But secondly, and maybe more seriously, if anything, it strikes me that this lack of separation that companies like Amazon exploit and Google and others is, if anything, even more nefarious than the railroads, because it also involves a very heavy layer of deception. I think there was just a story in the last few days about search results on Amazon being tweaked to show Amazon private label products over other products. And
Right.
there are other ways in which I think search results are manipulated. And that, to me, is just old-fashioned deception. I mean, if you had a shopkeeper who, if I walked in better dressed than the last customer, which is unlikely but possible, that if I walked in better dressed, he would like change all the prices and up them $1, or would hide certain. You'd say that guy's behaving unethically. If you
Right.
add to that monopoly power and dishonesty, I don't understand why more of the American people aren't up in arms over this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just this bias and discrimination. It's the combination of competing with your own rivals within the marketplace, but using the data in order to do that. And you give the example of the well-dressed man and the shopkeeper frantically changing the prices. Obviously, that can't be done on a large scale in a physical brick and mortar store. However, it's done on a routine basis on these shopping sites. Personalized pricing is a reality, and it uses sort of your social profile, your social graph, to know what you're willing to pay for a particular product. And this is done on a regular basis. And it's all part of this piece of, if you have the data on your customer, when they're going to buy, what they like to buy, then you can use that to your advantage so that your products are the ones that secure the best price, that get the highest profit margins, and that your competitors are edged out. And if you also own the mall, essentially, and then you're going to have this unfair advantage.
So you mentioned earlier on that a lot of people defending big tech are also in the pay of big tech. I think that was the first, basically, section of your piece. We don't, it's funny, I don't know if it's morally related, but I think it is. A lot of the news outlets who interview these people don't bring that up, which is its own form of information manipulation, if you ask me. But it seems, who are some of these people, or what are some of the arguments we're hearing that are somewhat manipulated in this sense?
Yeah, I mean, you can't escape it, right? The Google, Facebook, Amazon have spent enormous sums of money, not just on traditional lobbying, but to essentially underwrite academic think tank and opinion leadership, for lack of a better term, commentary. And it's hard to find a think tank or a academic institution that has not, at some point or another, taken money for underwriting from one of these big tech firms. And so when you see out there somebody like a Jeffrey Manning, who he was one of the most vociferous opponents to the Warren plan, said it would turn the internet into a sewer. He has written multiple papers with Google funding. He is their go-to academic resource if they want a perspective that looks like it's outside the company, a third-party unbiased source, right? To say that Google's practices are completely above board and proper. And he's just one example, and I give dozens within the course of a pretty short part in the top section of the piece. But the larger point is that this is inescapable to a certain degree. That these companies are so big and so powerful, they can essentially buy and launder opinions that may look to the untrained eye to be independent in some way or another, but are actually very much in line with Google's way of thinking. And it becomes almost this crutch. If you're an academic, you might want to say to yourself, well, I'm delivering unbiased research and I'm just doing my job. But you know that the money spigot is going to be turned off if you turn against Google. And you maybe even unconsciously tailor your opinions to this knowledge.
Yeah, what's that quote that's attributed, I think, sometimes to Upton Sinclair, and sometimes it is, I've heard it attributed to other people. You cannot convince someone of something to believe something if his livelihood depends on him not believing it. I think that applies here, and I also think they probably find people whose views that will be sympathetic to them to begin with, and elevate them with a lot of funding. So we really have a rigged marketplace, not just in products on Amazon, for example, but in the ideas about how to regulate Amazon. And on the politics side, you know, David Dayen, one of the things that surprised me about this is that you know, I think Senator Warren has been doing a great job pushing this issue and talking about very common sense and important ideas. I think the whole country needs to reinvigorate its thinking about antitrust and monopoly economics for the 21st century. And she's been doing a great job here. One of the things that's frustrated me a little bit from the political perspective is that obviously it's early in the primary process, but I don't see her ideas catching on a lot, and I'm a little bit concerned about that.
I think you can make a distinction between the ideas and whether or not the ideas have caught on, separate from the individual, right? What Senator Warren's, you might want to look at Senator Warren's role in the 2020 election at this point as not dissimilar to John Edwards' role in the 2008 election, where he wasn't ultimately the victor, but he drove the policy discussion and forced the entire field to move to his line of thinking on a host of subjects, climate, healthcare policy, what have you. I think that Warren at this early stage, and it's not to say that she can't change this dynamic, at this early stage, she's performing the same function. She is moving the field in her direction. We've seen Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker, even Beto O'Rourke talk about these policies and more broadly, the overwhelming force of monopolies in daily life. And they have followed her lead on these issues. Whether or not she is ultimately successful as a candidate, she's been successful as sort of a opinion leader on this topic. I do think there's been some success there in terms of moving the field and the center of gravity and where it is within the Democratic Party. So there are sort of two interlocking kind of dynamics to look for, whether the ideas are becoming prominent and whether the candidate is becoming prominent. And I do think from the standpoint of ideas, she has been successful.
And well, that's good to know. And you're right. As I think about it, I have seen these other candidates start to address the monopoly issue. And I also have confidence in her ability to present this topic forcefully once we get to the stage of actual debates and so on. So that should help advance the debate as well. And David Dayen, I also wanted to talk to you about another article you published recently, both for its subject and for what the subject represents. And the article, also in The Intercept, was given the headline, Wendell Primus, the most powerful staffer in Congress, represents a generational divide on the left. Now, Wendell Primus is a senior policy advisor, maybe the senior policy advisor, I guess, to Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. What spurred you to write this piece?
Well, you don't see a staffer's name repeatedly come up in political discussions and in articles to the degree that Wendell Primus has since the Democrats took over the House. And pretty much every area of tension between the Democratic leadership in the House and sort of this new crop of progressives has featured Wendell Primus. So Wendell Primus is mostly the health policy advisor for Nancy Pelosi. And he was found to have been giving these presentations out to insurance companies and to health researchers, kind of trashing Medicare for all and saying that senior leadership doesn't really agree with it. He has been essentially speaking for the speaker in discussions with the White House and with Senate Republicans over a drug pricing policy that is seen as a step down from the policy that House Democrats had been coalescing around, which was around Medicare drug negotiation, direct negotiation with the drug companies within Medicare. The policy that Lloyd Doggett had been, he's a House member from the Austin, Texas area, the policy he had been putting forward would include a negotiation, and if it didn't work out, a compulsory licensing of high-priced drugs so that generic manufacturers could immediately come in and compete. Primus has sort of taken over this legislation and moved it in the direction of having a third-party arbitrator, which would have some sort of binding or maybe even non-binding authority to pick a price from between where the Medicare negotiators want to go and where the drug companies want to go. And the drug companies seem to favor this policy over the compulsory licensing, and Primus has come down on that. So I kept seeing him over and over again in these debates, these intra-left debates. And you just don't see that very often. What I learned is that, there's a name for people like Primus. He's known as sort of a member staffer, someone who's been around for so long that he almost fashions himself a staffer and injects himself into these debates, empowered by the speaker, of course. And I wanted to get to know sort of his history and background more to sort of show what role he's playing in this debate and how it sort of more broadly illustrates this generational divide.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because, and Primus is, when you talk about a generational shift, you're really, in my interpretation, you're not talking about necessarily his age. I mean, Bernie Sanders, for example, is older than he is. But what you're talking about is, to me, is a generational shift within the Democratic Party. I mean, Wendell Primus and Nancy Pelosi in the 90s were much closer to the progressive cutting edge of the party. And you mentioned that Primus, for example, Wendell Primus resigned out of principle over the Clinton administration's decision to support what was euphemistically called welfare reform, which was a reform of a kind, but regressive towards people in need. And yet, with the passage of time, maybe they've changed somewhat. I think perhaps they have, but also the Overton window of what the party thinks and wants and believes has moved significantly to the left. So is part of the problem just that people who are entrenched with power like Wendell Primus, just don't reflect the party as it exists today?
I think that's part of it. I mean, Primus comes up in the 80s and 90s in the shadow of the Reagan Revolution when liberals saw their role as protecting what they could from the ravages of Reaganism. So it was protecting the meager pieces of the safety net. And you know, you could see that the principled resignation over welfare reform was in line with that, right? It was part of that idea that what a liberal does when they come to Washington is protect in amber everything that came out of the Great Society, and not take a step forward in that direction, and maybe even take steps back if it means that it's okay that you know, other programs are saved. I tell this story where Dean Baker, the economist, is talking to Primus in 2000, and this is while we have a surplus within the government. And Dean Baker had just written this book saying we don't have to cut Social Security, and Primus has him in. He's working at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities at this point, which is one of these organizations that really reflects this mindset. And Primus says to him, you know, don't be so hard-edged in not wanting cuts to Social Security because we might need that money. You know, I'm worried about how we pay for food stamps in 2015. And Baker says, aren't there other things to worry about than paying for food stamps in 2015? Can't we have a bolder vision, something that's not this narrow? And that's what Primus represents. So you know, you can see all of his position taking within this Democratic Party, the House takeover, as reflective of this mindset. We were beaten down by the Reagan years, and we just gotta hold on to what we have. And that's just not where the Democratic Party is right now. It's certainly not where the new progressives who have come into the party are. They want to really make some changes to affect the decades of stagnant wages and soaring inequality that have come about largely because of Reaganism. And they don't see just, can we hold on and pay for food stamps in 10 years as the sum total of what you do as a Democrat. So that is the tension. That is the entire source of this conflict. And I thought it was important through Wendell Primus to really spell it out.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing here is, you know, this is an issue that I think a lot of us have been struggling with and thinking about for a long time within the Democratic Party, which is, you know, sometimes it gets expressed and described as, you know, center-right versus left, or centrism versus progressivism, or, you know, and it's characterized as an ideological difference, and which I think in many cases it is. But I think what was interesting to me about your piece and about your take was that you were almost describing a psychological difference, but in an institutionalized psychological difference. Like I thought it was interesting. You pointed out that the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which has done a lot, you know, a lot of good research, a lot of good work, but that the name itself reflects a kind of, well, okay, you know, can we decide which pieces of furniture we throw overboard and which we get to keep, kind of the essence to it. And those aren't your words, but, you know, that's what I took from it. And in a sense, as I thought about it, and as we're talking about it in terms of the Wendell Primus case, and I'm still really ticked off at him doing this, by the way, just to put my cards on the table, but I'm wondering if there isn't an element in this of a kind of a Stockholm syndrome that you're, you know.
I think you bring up a great point here that it is psychological. I mean, if you look at his slide presentation that he showed to insurers, and he put down several reasons why Medicare for all is not the best way to go. And one of those reasons was very simply, stakeholders are against. And, you know, I challenge you to find any policy that would be meaningful where a stakeholder isn't against it. I mean, if you're saying stakeholders are against is the reason to not pursue a policy, then you're essentially consigning the Democratic Party, which is organized around taking on these fights against entrenched interests, as impotent for their sum total in politics. And it is this notion that we cannot do better than what we have right now. It's all we can do as a government. We cannot, break out of these confines. We cannot find solutions beyond, LIHEAP and food stamps and whatever jury-rigged kind of meager safety net that we have today. And it just won't work any other way. And it's almost this function of these staffers thinking they're the guardians of democracy in some way or another, that they have to tell duly elected officials within the Democratic Party the contours of what they can and can't do. And that's sort of the role that Primus has come to play. And it is a Stockholm Syndrome thing. It is a thing where the sort of, in the back of your mind belief that this is a center-right country and that we cannot break past these very narrow boundaries. And that's the length of the ambition that we're allowed to have. And that's just not where these new progressives are. And there's going to be tension if that's sort of the experience, the lived experience of the main health, particularly on healthcare, the main healthcare policy guru to the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, the more I think about this, the more interesting it gets in a way, although it particularly if you want to understand it, in my case at least, in order to overcome it and promote more visionary policies, which, when I first heard about this Wendell Primus giving the presentation to insurers and saw the slides and so on, I thought, well, the Speaker's office has to raise money. He's pandering to groups that give money, but it's not that. It doesn't appear to be that. It appears to be this much more interesting and deep-rooted problem, which is all the things you describe, and the fact that interestingly, when you see this all the time, a bullet point like stakeholders are against it means that you don't even consider the possibility that you get to make your case and it might change people's minds. Even before you make your case, it's like I can never talk to anybody who doesn't already agree with me because they don't already agree with me, so they're against me.
We should give people like Wendell Primus and Nancy Pelosi the benefit of the doubt. They sincerely believe this. They believe in deficit reduction. I mean, that's another whole part of this story, that Primus seems to be the ringleader behind Nancy Pelosi putting these rules in the House organizing that you need to do pay as you go. You need to fund every set of spending with an offset of cuts to the budget or new taxes. That's Wendell Primus, right? I mean, he sincerely believes that our deficit problems are significant enough that they should take priority over social programs, over benefits to society. I mean, he really does believe this stuff. He believes that the best way to go on healthcare is to strengthen the ACA and try to do some things around drug prices that can get buy-in from the Trump administration. That is their worldview, and if you are someone who doesn't agree with it, you should at least be able to try to understand it, so that you know who you're going against. And you should know that this isn't just a staffer sort of bigfooting upon the caucus. This is coming from Nancy Pelosi herself. I mean, Wendell Primus is nobody if he's not a top staffer who has the authority to be involved in these policy debates. There's not an ounce of separation between Pelosi and Primus on these matters. And we should be honest about that. Progressives should be honest about that and make their case thusly.
Yeah, I have a solution, David. My solution is term limits for staffers. And I'm waiting for the angry phone calls now to come in from all over this town of Washington, D.C. But in seriousness, so yes, if you're the kind of person who, like me, who believes that this is misguided view. I understand that to a certain extent, in fact, to a great extent, Nancy Pelosi holds this view too, and said as much in her eulogy for Pete Peterson, the billionaire who's done so much to promote this kind of thinking and so on. But thinking much more broadly than any one politician or even any one staffer, I don't know what the solution is except to keep saying over and over again, as you did in your piece, that in essence this is a historical, cultural artifact. It's a kind of inherited folkway a ritualistic response that no longer makes any sense. And here's what makes sense, and just keep going at it over and over every time it comes up. I don't know any other way to combat it. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's right, and this is going to play a role in the 2020 election, especially if Joe Biden ends up coming in, because he comes out of that world. I mean, he was in Washington in the 70s and 80s. Delaware went for Reagan twice, and I believe George H.W. Bush. He has this same sort of beaten down mindset and sincere belief in these structures that constrain the politics, and there's no other way to really go about this fight other than to take it head on. You can't just call for unity and think that all of us on this stage are basically the same and not actually play this out. This is, you hear these things like the soul of the Democratic Party or something like that, the battle for the soul of the party. This is it. This is what this is about. And if progressives shy from this fight in an attempt to just sort of be friends and not make trouble, we're going to miss this debate, and ultimately those who are in power now and who have this mindset are going to stay that way. It's too important to the future of the country, a country that for the least among us, for the middle class, isn't working the way it could. It's too important to them to step to the side of this debate, and so you have to take it head on.
Well, I think that's extremely well said. And as I believe it was Harry Truman said, if you want a friend, get a dog. And I'm going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. But David Dayen, writer and soon to be executive editor of the American Prospect, great writing. And as always, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Okay, thank you very much.